Normandy, June 1944. A hedgerow south of Cherbourg. A German grenadier is dug into the base of an earthen bank, in a position his pioneer unit tunneled through the embankment days before any American reached it. He has done everything right. His firing slit is screened with cut brush. His field of fire covers the sunken lane in front of him. He has heard American armor grinding somewhere to the north for the better part of an hour, and he has not fired, because firing reveals a position, and a revealed position dies. This is the first rule every experienced German infantryman carries in his bones by the summer of 1944. Be seen, and you are already dead. No American infantry patrol walks the lane in front of him. No scout points toward his bank. No forward observer lifts a pair of binoculars and calls out his position to the guns behind the line. And then, without any of the events that are supposed to come first, the air above the sunken lane tears open. There is no whistle. There is no shriek of an incoming artillery shell. No long descending wail that gives a man a half-second to flatten himself against the earth. There is only a sudden flat concussion overhead, and then another, and then a third, walking down the length of the hedgerow in a rhythm too fast and too regular to be field guns. Burning white streamers arc down into the position and hiss in the wet soil. When it is over, the men who survive cannot explain what happened. They were not under observation, no one had seen them, and they were being killed anyway, on a patch of ground that no enemy eye had confirmed was occupied. A German prisoner taken in this kind of fighting, questioned afterward by American officers, gives the killing a name that has nothing to do with mortars at all. He calls it automatic artillery. He is convinced the Americans have deployed some new kind of rapid-firing cannon, because nothing in his understanding of a mortar accounts for what just happened to his squad. He is wrong about the weapon, but he is pointing directly at the thing that makes it so dangerous, which is that it does not behave the way a mortar is supposed to behave, and it does not kill the way he was trained to expect to be killed. The weapon that did this was not a field gun. It was not one of the famous artillery pieces whose names fill the history books. It was a mortar, a stubby, ugly, front-heavy tube on a squat monopod, served by men who did not even belong to the artillery branch, and who, in many cases, had spent the early part of their careers being quietly mocked by the rest of the army. The Americans who fired it called it the four-deuce, because its bore measured 4.2 inches across. And the strangest thing about it, the fact that sits at the center of this entire story, is that it was never designed to fire high explosive at anyone. It was built for a completely different war. A war of poison gas that, by the grace of enormous luck and mutual fear, was never actually fought. So there is a puzzle here, and it is worth stating plainly before we solve it. How did a weapon designed to spray clouds of toxic chemicals, operated by the least prestigious branch in the United States Army, a branch that was nearly abolished a few years before the war, become one of the most feared infantry support weapons on the Western Front? And more specifically, why did German soldiers, who had faced mortars for years, who had their own excellent mortars, come to respect this particular American weapon more than almost anything else the infantry threw at them? The answer is not that the Americans invented a better mortar in the narrow sense. The answer is that they built a weapon for one war, were denied that war, and discovered almost by accident that the thing they had built was murderously well suited to the war they actually had to fight. To understand why the four-deuce unsettled the Germans so badly, you first have to take the weapon seriously, and that means going back to the war before this one. In the trenches of the First World War, gas arrived as one of the great terrors of the age, and the way it was first delivered was almost as clumsy as it was frightening. The early method was the gas cloud. You lined up hundreds of pressurized cylinders in your own forward trench, opened the valves when the wind was right, and let a rolling bank of chlorine drift across no man's land toward the enemy. It was a horrifying weapon, but it was also a deeply unreliable one. Everything depended on the wind. If the breeze died, the cloud hung over your own lines. If it shifted, the cloud came back and gassed the men who had released it. And a slow-moving cloud, visible and often smelling of its own chemistry, gave the enemy time to see it coming and pull on their masks. The British, who suffered these problems as much as anyone, wanted a better way. What they needed was a device that could throw a chemical payload directly into the enemy trench, on demand, regardless of the wind, quickly and in volume. The answer was the Deuce Mortar, invented in the middle of the war. It was a plain, smooth barrel on a simple bipod, and its beauty was its simplicity. A crew dropped a finned bomb down the muzzle, it struck a fixed firing pin at the bottom, and it was flung out in a high arc. There was no complicated breech, no recoil system, almost nothing to go wrong. A good crew could drop one bomb after another down the tube so fast that several were in the air at once, raining perhaps 20 rounds a minute onto a target 1,000 yards away. It was crude, it was inaccurate, but it could put a great deal of material onto a patch of enemy ground in a very short time, and that speed and volume made it a natural fit for smoke and for gas. Where the cloud was slow and treacherous, the mortar was sudden and aimed. The Americans who would carry this idea forward belonged to a brand new and deeply strange organization. When the United States entered the war, it had almost no capacity for chemical warfare of its own, and it had to learn the whole grim craft in a hurry, largely from the British and the French. In 1918, the country formalized this effort into the Chemical Warfare Service, a branch of the army devoted entirely to gas, both the delivering of it and the defending against it. Its first gas and flame troops, the men of the 1st Gas Regiment, took British Deuce mortars into the line in the last months of the war and used them to lay smoke and throw gas in support of American attacks. Hundreds more of these mortars were manufactured back in the United States, though most arrived too late to see action before the armistice. When the fighting stopped, this small branch was left holding a weapon it believed in, and a mission that most of the rest of the army found distasteful and actively wanted to forget. The 1920s and 1930s were not kind to the Chemical Warfare Service. Gas was politically toxic in every sense of the phrase. The public loathed it, having seen the blinded and the ruined lungs come home from France. Statesmen moved to ban it, and international agreements sought to outlaw its use in future wars. And the whole military budget was cut savagely through the lean years and then the Depression, which meant that a branch dedicated to a weapon nobody wanted to think about, and many hoped never to use, was an easy target for the axe. The men who kept the flame alive did so in a kind of institutional exile, working on problems the rest of the army preferred to ignore, in the certainty that if a great war ever came again, gas would surely come with it, and someone would have to be ready. But inside that unloved branch, a few officers kept working on the mortar, and they made a genuine breakthrough, one that would matter enormously 2 decades later. The chief of the branch in the early years wanted the mortar to reach farther, roughly to double the range of the old wartime Stokes, and the obvious first attempts failed. When engineers tried simply to fit larger fins to the bombs to stabilize a heavier, longer flight, the violent shock of the propellant going off tore the fins up and sent the rounds tumbling wildly. The finned bomb had reached the limit of what it could do. The problem with the old Stokes ran deeper than range, though. It was accuracy. A smooth barrel firing a finned bomb was fine for saturating a trench with gas at short distance, where precision hardly mattered, but it scattered its rounds far too widely to do careful, deliberate work against a specific point. So a chemical officer named Lewis McBride, working with a scientist named Dr. Maxwell, tried something that nobody associated with mortars at all. They cut rifling into the barrel. Rifling is the spiral grooving machined into the inside of a rifle or an artillery piece, and it spins the projectile as it leaves the muzzle. That spin is what makes a bullet fly straight and true, the way a well-thrown football spirals instead of tumbling. Rifles used it. Artillery used it. Mortars did not. Mortars relied on fins, but McBride cut the grooves anyway, in several experimental barrels with different rates of twist, to see which would work. And on the 7th of June 1924, one of those rifled barrels threw 3 shells more than 2,000 yards on clean, accurate, spinning flights. The machining of the grooves had also widened the bore slightly, from 4 inches across to 4.2. In that single test, the old smooth bore Stokes reached the end of its life, and the new 4.2-inch chemical mortar was born, and with it something almost unheard of on a battlefield, a mortar that could shoot with the accuracy of an artillery piece. Making that rifling work, though, required solving a whole chain of hard engineering problems, because rifling a mortar breaks the very things that make a mortar simple. Start with the basic contradiction. A rifle spins its bullet, because the bullet is forced down the barrel and its jacket bites directly into the grooves. But a mortar shell is dropped down the tube from the open muzzle, so by definition, it has to be loose enough to fall freely to the bottom, which means it cannot grip the grooves on the way in. The chemical engineers solved this with a clever device built into the base of the shell, two round metal plates, one of softer brass and one of steel. When the propellant fired, the sudden gas pressure rammed the steel plate hard against the brass plate behind it, and squeezed the edge of the softer brass outward until it bit into the rifling grooves. That expanding brass ring did two jobs at once. It sealed the barrel so none of the propellant gas escaped uselessly past the shell, and it caught the spin of the grooves and forced the shell to spiral out of the muzzle. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, and it turned a dropped bomb into a spinning, accurate projectile. That was only the first problem. Spinning the shell created new ones the smooth bore had never faced. The old wartime fuse had been designed so that a tumbling bomb would go off, no matter which way it landed. On a spinning shell, that same fuse would be thrown into action by the spin itself, and might detonate at the muzzle, killing the crew. So a new fuse had to be designed, one that could be set to burst either on impact or after a timed interval in the air. And there was the matter of the filling. Remember that this was a chemical weapon meant to carry a liquid agent inside it. In a spinning shell, a sloshing liquid load would throw the round off balance and wreck its accuracy. So engineers fitted vanes inside the shell to make the liquid spin along with the casing rather than slosh against it. Even the base plate had to be reinvented. The light plank and cup of the Stokes shattered under the recoil of the bigger, harder-hitting weapon, so a forged steel base plate was built to soak up the punishment. Piece by piece, an entire weapon was redesigned around a single idea that a mortar could be made to spin its shells and shoot like a gun. The range was set by the propellant, and the propellant itself is worth picturing, because the men who served the gun handled it constantly and in the dark. The charge came as flat square sheets of powder with a hole in the middle, strung together like pages of a book and bundled around the tail of the shell below the fuse. The crews called them cheese charges because a stack of the little sheets looked like slices of cheese. The principle was simple. To shoot farther, you added sheets, and the extra powder threw the shell out to a longer range. To drop the round in closer, you stripped sheets away. A gunner learned to read the range table and build the charge by feel, tearing off increments with cold fingers under a shielded light, trusting that the men on the guns beside him were building exactly the same charge. Get it wrong, and the rounds would scatter long or fall short onto your own people. The weapon was standardized as the M1 in 1928 and refined over the following years into an improved model with a longer reach, the version that would eventually go to war. By the time the Second World War arrived, the Chemical Warfare Service had, in this odd rifled mortar, one of the most accurate weapons of its kind anywhere in the world. And it was built, still, for a single purpose: to lay down smoke to blind the enemy, and to deliver poison gas if gas was ever used. Its whole reason to exist was chemical. High explosive was not the point. In fact, the branch had to fight for permission to fire high explosive at all, and that fight is where this story turns. Here is the thing that almost ended the four-deuce before it ever fired a shot in anger. In 1935, the War Department decided the chemical mortar was surplus to requirements. Production was stopped. The 81mm mortar was named the standard weapon for chemical units, and the 4.2-inch mortar was, for a moment, a dead program, a clever idea with no future. It was pulled back from the edge only as war approached, and the army realized it might need every specialized tool it could get. The weapon that would terrify German infantry in Normandy came within a hair of being cancelled in peacetime as an answer to a question no one was asking. Then came the great absence that defined the whole war for chemical troops. Everyone expected gas. Both sides had it. Both sides had used it in the previous war and remembered it with horror. The choking clouds, the blistered skin, the men led blinded down the trenches with their hands on the shoulders of the man in front. Every army in the Second World War issued gas masks to its soldiers and drilled them constantly in their use, because everyone assumed that sooner or later the gas would come. Civilians in London and Berlin carried masks in cardboard boxes. The expectation was total. Germany, for its part, had secretly developed a family of nerve agents of terrifying lethality, weapons far deadlier than anything from the First War, and the Allies knew nothing about them. Had those agents ever been loosed, the casualties could have been catastrophic. And yet, through the entire conflict in Europe, neither side ever used chemical weapons against the other on the battlefield. The reasons were a tangle of fear, calculation, and deterrence. Each side knew the other could retaliate in kind, and no one wanted to be the first to open a door that could never be closed again. There was a genuine, if grim, balance of terror. Gas offered no decisive advantage great enough to justify the certain, massive retaliation it would bring down, and so the masks stayed in their boxes, the gas shells stayed in their depots, and one of the most dreaded possibilities of the war simply never came to pass. For the ordinary soldier, that restraint was a mercy beyond price. But for the Chemical Warfare Service, the branch built entirely around this weapon, the result was a strange kind of crisis. The thing they had spent 20 years perfecting, the whole reason the branch existed, was going to war with its central mission sitting unused and boxed up in storage. An entire branch of the army faced the prospect of contributing nothing to the fighting, holding a weapon that everyone hoped would never be fired for its intended purpose. They needed another way to matter, and the rifled mortar, it turned out, was the answer. So the branch made an argument that would change its fortunes completely. If the mortar was not going to throw gas, let it throw high explosive. Let it be a killing weapon in the plain conventional sense. This was not an obvious sell. High explosive fire support was the jealously guarded business of the field artillery, and here was the least respected branch in the army proposing to horn in on it with a mortar. But the case was strong, and it rested on a single startling comparison. The chemical branch argued that in a given span of time, their little mortar could put roughly 4.5 times as much high explosive onto a target as the standard 105mm howitzer could, albeit at shorter range. And the mortar weighed a small fraction of what the howitzer weighed. A howitzer was a 2-ton piece of ordnance that needed a truck to tow it. The mortar and its mount together weighed a few hundred pounds and could, in theory, be carried by its crew. The War Department authorized high explosive ammunition for the 4.2-inch mortar in March of 1943 and directed that its doctrine be rewritten around the new role. That decision, quiet and bureaucratic, is the hinge on which everything else turns. A gas weapon had just been reborn as a high explosive weapon, weeks before it would first be tested in real combat, and the high explosive shell it fired was a genuinely vicious thing. A round weighed a little over 20 pounds and packed roughly 8 pounds of explosive filler, which is close to a third of the total weight of the shell. That is an unusually high proportion of explosive to metal, what engineers call a high loading efficiency, and it meant the shell delivered a blast and fragmentation effect out of all proportion to its size. In terms of raw destructive charge, the four-deuce shell sat between the 105mm and the far larger 155mm artillery rounds. From a weapon light enough for infantrymen to serve, that was a staggering amount of violence per shell. Because the mortar now had to fire this heavier round out to greater ranges, its barrel and baseplate were strengthened, and the improved weapon was designated the M2. The old lighter barrels were deliberately marked differently, so that no crew would accidentally fire the powerful new charges through a worn-out tube and destroy themselves. Then there was the other shell, the one German prisoners would remember for the rest of their lives. White phosphorus. Phosphorus burns fiercely on contact with air, and it does not stop burning when it lands on cloth or equipment or skin. A single white phosphorus mortar round, when it bursts, throws burning particles across a circle roughly 40 yards wide, and sets fire to anything easily combustible within it. Fired in a high arc, the burning fragments rained down into open foxholes and trenches, the very positions that were supposed to be safe from flat trajectory fire. The Chemical Warfare Service produced more than 3 million white phosphorus mortar shells during the war, more than every other type of round it made, except plain high explosive. The mortar could switch, round to round, from tearing a position apart with explosive to drowning it in blinding burning smoke. Against dug-in infantry, that combination was close to a nightmare. Who fired these weapons matters, because it explains part of why the Germans found the fire so hard to make sense of. The 4.2-inch mortars were not organic to the infantry divisions. They belonged to separate chemical mortar battalions, non-divisional units, that were attached to infantry divisions as needed and moved around the battlefield as the situation demanded. When a division was pulled out of the line, its mortar battalion often stayed behind and went straight to work for the fresh division that replaced it. Demand for these battalions became so intense that commanders regarded them as essential. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army in Italy, and General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, both issued the same firm instruction in their theaters. No infantry division was to be committed to battle without a chemical mortar battalion attached to it. 25 of these battalions eventually served overseas. A weapon that had nearly been cancelled in peacetime was now something that famous army commanders refused to go into battle without. The men who fired it had their own affectionate names for the thing. Officially, it was the 4.2-inch chemical mortar. To the crews it was the four-deuce, from the numbers of its bore, and that is the name that stuck the longest. Some also called it the goon gun, because of the fat, bullet-shaped, spin-stabilized shells it fired, and its stubby, top-heavy look on its single leg of a mount. The chief of the chemical branch himself once called it a surprise weapon, affectionately known as the goon gun. It was not a glamorous weapon, and nobody pretended otherwise. It was squat and awkward and heavy, and it was about to become one of the most useful things the American infantry had. The four-deuce first fired in anger on the 10th of July 1943 in the invasion of Sicily. Several chemical battalions went ashore with the assault waves, and in the 38 days of that campaign, they fired something on the order of 35,000 rounds, more than 9/10 of it high explosive. The gas mortar had gone to war as a conventional killing weapon on its very first day, and it announced itself immediately. Near the town of Gela, the mortars stood behind the Rangers as an Italian armoured counterattack came rolling toward the beachhead, and the crews fired high explosive and phosphorus into the advancing tanks and infantry, helping to break the attack. In another incident during the Sicily fighting, a chemical mortar crew put 8 rounds into a circle only 15 yards across, and one of those rounds dropped straight through the open top hatch of a disabled German armoured vehicle. That is not the performance of a crude area weapon flinging bombs in the general direction of the enemy. That is precision, from a mortar, at a range where the target could not even see the tube that was killing it. The men who had been mocked as mule drivers had, on their first campaign, put a shell through an open hatch from beyond visual range. Now we can name the thing that made this weapon so unnerving to the men on the receiving end, and it comes down to a combination of qualities that no other single weapon on the battlefield brought together at once. Take them one at a time, because each one matters, and it is the stacking of them that did the damage. First, the trajectory. The four-deuce fired in a high, steep arc, and it came almost straight down onto its target. Artillery, firing on a flatter path, could not reach a man tucked behind a reverse slope, or down in a sunken lane, or folded into the back of a hedgerow bank. The mortar could drop its round vertically into exactly those spaces. In the mountains of Italy, in the maze of the Normandy hedgerows, in the ravines and reverse slopes where infantry actually hid, the plunging fire of the four-deuce reached into the dead ground that protected men from everything else. Concealment behind an obstacle meant nothing when death arrived from directly overhead. Second, and this is the quality the German prisoner was reaching for when he said automatic artillery, the rate of fire. A trained crew could sustain a steady stream of rounds and, in a short violent burst, could put 20 or more shells into the air before the first one had even landed. Picture that for a moment. A single tube, and yet a dozen or 20 explosions could walk across a position in a matter of seconds, arriving in a rolling wave. To a soldier being shelled, that did not feel like a mortar, which he understood as a slower, single thumping weapon. It felt like a battery of rapid-firing guns. It felt like automatic artillery. The volume of fire from a handful of tubes could equal what a man expected only from a line of field guns. Third, and perhaps most sinister, the silence. This is the detail that recurs again and again in the accounts. The 4.2-inch shell flew relatively slowly, and it made almost no noise in flight. An incoming artillery shell announces itself. It screams, or whistles, or wails, and that sound, terrifying as it is also a warning. It gives a veteran a fraction of a second to throw himself flat, to find a hole, to react. The four-deuce shell gave no such warning. It arrived in near silence, and the first thing a man knew of it was the explosion itself. There was no incoming scream to drop to, no half-second of grace. The blast simply happened, on top of you, out of a quiet sky. Combine that silence with the plunging trajectory and the sudden rolling volume, and you have a weapon that struck without warning, from an unseen tube, into positions that were supposed to be safe, faster than the mind could process. That is why prisoners described being hit by something they could not identify and could not understand. And fourth, threaded through all of it, the accuracy that the rifling had brought back in 1924. This was not an area weapon flinging rounds in the general direction of the enemy. Because it spun its shells like an artillery piece, the four-deuce could be walked in close to friendly troops and dropped precisely onto a specific bank, a specific building, a specific gun position. Unit accounts describe fire being called in within 50 yards of the Americans' own infantry. A weapon that accurate, that fast, that silent, and that steep in its fall was a genuinely new problem, and it is no wonder that experienced German soldiers, men who thought they knew every weapon on the battlefield, struggled to place it. There is one more thing to understand about how these qualities came together in practice, because it explains the deepest source of the German confusion. The men firing the mortar usually could not see their target either, and that was by design, not by accident. The gun crews sat behind cover, sometimes behind a ridge or a building, with nothing but the sky in front of them. The eyes of the weapon were somewhere else entirely, out ahead with the infantry, in the form of a forward observer. This observer, watching the enemy ground through binoculars, would identify a target, work out where it sat on his map, and send that location back to the crews by radio or field telephone as a set of map coordinates. The crews took the coordinates, calculated the aim and the charge from their firing tables, and dropped the rounds onto a piece of ground they had never laid eyes on. This is called indirect fire, and it is the ordinary way artillery works. But paired with a fast, accurate, silent mortar that the infantry itself controlled, it produced something that felt, to the men on the receiving end, like sorcery. Think about what that meant for the German in the hedgerow. The killing did not require that any single American soldier ever actually see him. It required only that an observer somewhere decide that his hedgerow, his bank, his patch of ground, was the kind of place a defender would be, and pass along the coordinates. A suspicion, translated into 6 numbers on a map, was enough to bring the fire down. The German could be perfectly concealed from every American eye, and still be perfectly located as a grid reference. And because the mortar was quick and controlled by men close to the front, rather than by some distant artillery headquarters, that fire could arrive within minutes of the suspicion forming, before the German had any reason to think he had been noticed at all, because in the ordinary sense he had not been. It helps to set the four-deuce against what the Germans themselves fielded, because the Germans were not amateurs at mortars. Far from it. The German army was extremely good with mortars, and used them intelligently and aggressively throughout the war. Their standard 8-centimeter mortar, a weapon of about 81 millimeters, was excellent, quick to fire and quick to move, and German crews were expert with it. But it was a lighter weapon, in the same weight class as the American 81 millimeter mortar, not a rival to the heavier four-deuce. Where the Germans reached for real weight, they turned to a 12-centimeter mortar, a heavy 120mm weapon that they had come to respect the hard way, on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets used a mortar of that size to devastating effect. The Germans were so impressed by the Soviet weapon that they copied it, and also pressed captured examples straight into their own service. That heavy mortar threw a bigger shell than the four-deuce and outranged it, but it was a much heavier piece, hard to move quickly, mounted for towing on a wheeled carriage, and it was smooth-bored, which meant it did not have the pinpoint rifled accuracy of the American weapon. The Germans also had their fearsome rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer, whose very name means smoke thrower, a nod to the fact that it too began partly as a chemical delivery weapon. American soldiers dreaded its rockets, and gave them nicknames like Screaming Mimes for the unearthly shriek they made in flight. But the Nebelwerfer was the opposite of the four-deuce in almost every way that mattered. It was loud, announcing itself with a terrifying wail. It was an area weapon, meant to saturate a zone rather than strike a point, and it was wildly inaccurate compared to the rifled American mortar. So the contrast runs deep. The Germans had heavier mortars and louder rockets, but they had nothing that combined the four-deuce entire package. Nothing that was at once this accurate, this fast, this silent in flight, this steep in its plunge, this rich in blinding white phosphorus, and this light enough to follow the infantry into terrain where the guns could not go. The Germans respected the weapon precisely because they understood mortars, and they could see that this one did things a mortar was not supposed to be able to do. There is one more piece of the German picture that turns their respect from anecdote into something documented, and it comes from the top of their own chemical establishment. After the war, the United States Army had captured German officers write monographs on their wartime experience, and among them was Lieutenant General Hermann Ochsner, who had commanded Germany chemical troops. Ochsner was not a man inclined to flatter his enemy. He was an expert, assessing a rival weapon on its technical merits, and his verdict was unambiguous. He wrote that from a technical point of view, the American 4.2-inch chemical mortar was very good, that its construction was simple, that it was a very handy weapon in battle, and that its firing efficiency was high. He went further on the ammunition. He said the American white phosphorus ammunition was outstandingly good. Consider what that is. The head of the German chemical warfare troops, writing for the record, singling out the American mortar and its phosphorus shell for specific praise. That is not a legend passed around a campfire. That is the enemy expert, on paper, admitting the weapon was excellent. You can trace that respect through specific battles, and the details are vivid. In Sicily, the mortar battalions supporting the Rangers became so integral that one of them was remembered as the artillery of the Rangers, providing the heavy punch that those light, fast-moving raiding units otherwise entirely lacked. The Rangers had no field guns of their own. The chemical mortars became their artillery, following them into places wheeled guns could not go, and delivering the weight of fire that turned a raiding force into something that could stand and fight. At Salerno, on the Italian mainland, mortar companies supporting the Rangers in the mountain passes above the beachhead fired more than 14,000 rounds in the first 2 weeks alone, holding open the flank of the whole invasion. The fighting there grew so close and so desperate that the mortarmen sometimes had to set aside their tubes, take up rifles, and fight as infantry to hold their own positions, and then go back to the guns when the crisis passed. At the Anzio beachhead, that grim, cramped lodgment where the Allies came ashore and then found themselves penned in and shelled from the hills for months, the chemical mortars were in action from the very first day of the landings. Over the long ordeal that followed, one of the battalions there fired more than 50,000 rounds. On a beachhead where every position was exposed and the German observers looked down from the high ground onto everything the Allies did, the ability to reach back with heavy, accurate plunging fire was a lifeline. At Monte Cassino, beneath the ancient monastery on its mountain, chemical mortars did some of their most important work of the entire Italian campaign. There the crews laid continuous curtains of smoke across the exposed valley of the river below, screening the men and vehicles trying to cross from the German observers on the heights, while at the same time pouring high explosive and phosphorus onto the fortified slopes. Laying a smokescreen sounds gentle beside high explosive, but on that battlefield it saved lives by the hundred, hiding the crossings from the guns that would otherwise have slaughtered everything that moved. It was, in a sense, the weapon returning briefly to its original purpose. The chemical branch had always been meant to lay smoke. Here that skill, married to the accuracy of the rifled tube, blinded the enemy at the exact moment it mattered most. In Normandy, the mortar battalions were in the fight from the opening hour. One battalion went ashore on Utah Beach within the first hour of the landings and was soon firing in support of the advance toward Cherbourg. In the drive to take that port city, that battalion fired nearly 12,000 white phosphorus rounds, along with many thousands more of high explosive, blanketing the German defenses in burning smoke. During that fighting, a rolling barrage laid down by one of its companies was so effective that Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. telephoned his personal congratulations directly to the mortar positions. This was the same terrain, the hedgerow country, where the German defense had been built entirely around not being seen, around the plunging ambush from concealment. And here was a weapon that did not need to see them, that could drench a suspected hedgerow in silent plunging fire and burning phosphorus whether or not a single German had ever been spotted. In the campaign in Brittany, the pattern sharpened into something almost like a signature. During the reduction of the old walled city of Saint-Malo, where a German garrison held out in a fortress that seemed impossible to storm, a mortar company fired white phosphorus toward the fortress until the position became untenable and the German commander surrendered. That commander, according to the mortar battalion own history, complained bitterly that the use of white phosphorus had been inhumane, and admitted that it had forced his capitulation. And it was during this Brittany fighting, at the port of Brest, that German prisoners are recorded giving the weapon the name that captures the whole story in 2 words. According to the battalion history, they called the white phosphorus shell Whispering Death, whispering for the near silence of its arrival, death for what came out of that silence. As the Allied armies pushed toward Germany and the fighting slid into the grim autumn and winter of 1944, the mortar battalions were in the worst of it. In the Hurtgen forest, that dark, dripping expanse of pine where the American advance ground to a bloody halt, the mortars fired blind through the trees at an enemy who could rarely be seen at all, dropping rounds into the draws and firebreaks where German infantry gathered. The high, plunging trajectory mattered enormously in that terrain, because rounds could be brought down into small clearings and reverse slopes that no flat trajectory weapon could reach. But the forest was cruel to the weapon and its crews alike. Shells that clipped the treetops burst high in the branches and rained fragments down, a danger to everyone below, and the cold and the mud fouled the guns and swallowed the base plates. Then came the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December, the battle the world remembers as the Battle of the Bulge. When German armor and infantry came pouring out of the winter fog, chemical mortar battalions were among the units that helped hold the shoulders of the breakthrough. On the northern shoulder, where the German drive had to be stopped or the whole line would unravel, a mass of American guns was gathered to break up the attacks, and a battalion of 4.2-inch mortars was folded into that defensive fire and coordinated along with the artillery. In this fighting, the white phosphorus round came into its own as a weapon of raw shock. Fired into massed German infantry and onto advancing tanks, the phosphorus threw up blinding, burning clouds. Accounts from the mortar battalions describe German tank drivers losing their bearings in the smoke and blundering off course, and German foot soldiers breaking in panic as the burning particles came down among them. One battalion passed its 100,000th round fired during this period, a single unit that had put 100,000 bombs into the enemy since it first went into action. The weapon that had almost been cancelled in peacetime was now being counted in 6-figure totals of rounds fired. Into the spring of 1945, as the armies fought across Germany itself, the mortars kept up the same brutal work. In the fighting for the city of Aschaffenburg, where a fanatical garrison turned the streets into a fortress, A single mortar company fired more than 1,500 rounds into the town in the last 3 days of March, pounding strongpoints house by house while the infantry worked forward behind the fire. This was the pattern everywhere in the last months. The infantry located a strongpoint, the mortars drenched it in high explosive and phosphorus, and the position that had looked impossible to take suddenly became possible. And this was not only a European weapon. Across the world, in the Pacific, the four-deuce found a whole different kind of war and adapted to it. In the jungles and volcanic islands where the Japanese fought from caves and bunkers and elaborate underground positions, the plunging fire of the mortar was again exactly the right tool. Rounds could be dropped almost vertically onto cave mouths and into ravines that no other weapon could reach. Mortar crews used their fire to seal cave entrances, collapsing the openings and entombing the defenders inside. Captured Japanese documents reportedly urged their own artillery to make the American mortar positions a priority target, a backhanded testament to how much the fire hurt. The islands posed their own miseries. There were places jeeps and trucks could not go at all, and crews had to break the heavy weapon into its loads and manhandle every piece forward through mud and jungle, or improvise pack animals to carry it. The Pacific also produced one of the strangest chapters in the weapon's story. Because the mortar was relatively light and did not recoil against a wheeled carriage, engineers found they could bolt whole banks of them onto the decks of small landing craft, turning ordinary boats into floating batteries. These mortar gunboats first fired in support of the Peleliu landings, and then off other islands, and their moment of greatest fury came at Okinawa. There, dozens of these little gunboats, mounting more than 100 mortars between them, steamed along the coast and laid a curtain of shells onto a strip of the shoreline, saturating a long band of beach and its defences in a storm of fire delivered in under an hour, softening the ground before the troops went in. A weapon designed in the 1920s to throw gas from a fixed pit had become, 20 years later, a naval bombardment system firing from the deck of a boat. That is how far the four-deuce had travelled from its origins, and how adaptable the basic idea turned out to be. It is worth being careful and honest here, because a script that claims to be accurate has to be accurate about its own evidence too. Some of these German reactions are best documented, like General Ochsner written technical assessment, which comes straight from his own post-war monograph. Others, like the Whispering Death nickname and the Surrendering Commander complaint about phosphorus, come from the histories written by the American mortar battalions themselves, which means they are Americans recording what they heard the Germans say. That does not make them false, but it is fair to say the strongest single piece of German respect on the record is Ochsner's sober, technical, professional judgment that the weapon was very good and its phosphorus outstanding. The nicknames and the anecdotes cluster around that solid core and point in exactly the same direction. The men who served this weapon deserve their place in the story, because the four-deuce was brutally hard to fight with, and the crews paid for its effectiveness with their backs and their blood. Assembled, the mortar broke down into 3 main loads. There was the barrel, at around 100 pounds, there was the mount, at around 50 pounds, and there was the base plate, at around 175 pounds, an awkward, savage slab of steel that took several men to move and that punished everyone who carried it. Add the ammunition, at more than 20 pounds a round, and a crew moving its weapon by hand was hauling a staggering dead weight over exactly the kind of ground, mountains, mud, and jungle that the weapon was prized for reaching. Where trucks and jeeps and mules could not go, the men carried and dragged the pieces themselves, load by load, trip by trip. They had trained for this in a way that had made them a laughingstock. In the mountains of the United States, before they ever shipped out, crews hauled small carts loaded with the mortar or with ammunition, weighing 500 or 600 pounds, up and down steep ridge trails until they could barely stand. Soldiers from other units watched these men straining against the harness of a cart and mocked them, making braying donkey noises and cracking jokes about mules. It was not a proud sight. But those same mocked men, hauling their carts up the Blue Ridge, were building the endurance that would let them get a heavy weapon into firing positions that no one else could reach, and the men who would later be demanded by name by famous generals began the war as the butt of the army's jokes. In combat, the weapon fought its own crews as much as the enemy. The baseplate, under the hammering shock of firing, would drive itself down into soft ground until the tube's aim was ruined, and crews sometimes had to hitch a jeep to it and haul it back out of its own crater after only a few rounds. On hard, rocky ground, the opposite happened, and the baseplate could crack under the strain. The barrels themselves, firing heavy, high explosive round after round out to long range, wore out and bent and broke, and the elevating and traversing screws that aimed the tube stripped and jammed under the strain. This happened most often precisely when the crews were pushed hardest, firing at extreme range to reach German mortars and rockets that outranged them. In one documented case, after the first 3 weeks of the fighting in Italy, one hard-worked company had only 3 of its mortars still in action at all. The men kept firing with what they had. That is the reality behind the clean statistics of rounds fired. Every one of those hundreds of thousands of rounds was a shell lifted by hand, dropped down a hot tube, over a baseplate that was trying to bury itself, by men who had dragged the whole apparatus there on their own shoulders. The weapon had real limits, and an honest account names them. It was heavy and exhausting to move by hand. Its range, even after improvement, was consistently shorter than that of the German heavy mortars and rockets, which sometimes forced the crews to set up dangerously far forward, ahead of their own infantry, just to bring the enemy into reach. Early in its combat life, shells sometimes burst in or just above the tube, a terrifying failure that killed and maimed the very crews serving the gun, and it took time and careful engineering work on the fuses to run the problem down and fix it. The aiming sight drew complaints too, for a limited traverse and for being hard to use at night, and crews sometimes scavenged captured enemy sights to do the job better. This was not a miracle weapon without flaws. It was a specialized tool with sharp edges that cut the men who used it as well as the enemy. But within the band of situations it was built for, plunging fire, rapid fire, accurate fire, and above all the delivery of blinding, burning phosphorus onto positions that thought they were safe, it had no equal on the battlefield. The verdict of the war did not end the weapon's story. It vindicated it. The four-deuce had gone into the conflict as an orphan, a chemical weapon with no chemical war to fight, tolerated rather than wanted. It came out the other side having proven, in campaign after campaign, that a heavy mortar in the hands of the infantry was one of the most valuable things on the battlefield. So instead of being retired with the peace, the concept was carried forward and improved. In the years after the war, responsibility for the weapon passed from the chemical branch toward the ordnance and infantry establishment, an acknowledgement that this was now, first and foremost, a conventional infantry weapon and not a chemical one. A new model was developed with a circular baseplate that let it turn and fire in any direction without being dug up and reset, and with a longer range that answered one of the old weapon's chief complaints. That improved 4.2-inch mortar went to war again in Korea, where the plunging fire and heavy shell proved just as useful in the ridges and valleys of that peninsula as they had in Italy and France. One chemical mortar battalion, the same kind of unit that had fought across Europe, served through the Korean fighting and poured out hundreds of thousands of rounds before being redesignated as a plain heavy mortar battalion of the infantry, its chemical lineage finally set aside for good. The weapon soldiered on into the Vietnam era as well, still doing the same essential job, dropping heavy explosive fire onto targets that flatter weapons could not reach. In the end, the 4.2-inch mortar was replaced, not because the idea behind it was wrong, but because the idea had won so completely that it was time for a bigger, more modern version of the same thing. The American Army eventually adopted a heavy mortar of a larger caliber, a smooth, bored, fin-stabilized 120mm weapon of a kind that had by then become the international standard for heavy infantry mortars, and the old rifled four-deuce was gradually phased out of service. But every heavy mortar battery that supports infantry today traces its practical lineage back through that lineage of heavy tubes, back to a stubby rifled weapon that a scorned branch had kept alive through the lean years, and that had gone to war, built for a purpose it was never allowed to serve. Step back now and look at the whole shape of it, because the deepest point of this story is not really about a tube and a baseplate. It is about two different ideas of how war works, colliding in the same French field. The German soldier in that hedgerow was the product of a superb tactical tradition, one that prized initiative, concealment, and the judgment of the man on the spot. His entire survival was built on a single proposition: if you are not seen, you are not hit. Concealment was life. The whole German defense of the hedgerow country rested on that idea: the hidden position and the held fire, the ambush sprung from cover and then vacated before the enemy could locate it. Against an opponent playing by the same rules, an opponent who also believed that killing required first seeing, that system was brilliant, and it worked. It bled attackers white. The four-deuce belonged to a different idea entirely, and this is the twist that the German soldier could not see from inside his own framework. The weapon and the doctrine around it did not treat seeing the enemy as the thing that had to happen before the enemy could be killed. They treated the location as the target, not the man, the ground. If a hedgerow was the kind of place a defender would be, then the hedgerow got drenched, silently and accurately and in volume, whether or not any single defender had ever been confirmed by a human eye. The German soldier concealment was a property of his body, of where his body was and how well it was hidden. But the four-deuce shells were not aimed at his body. They were aimed at the square of earth his body happened to occupy, and no amount of concealment changes the ground you are standing on. That is why the prisoners spoke the way they did. In the German model of combat, being killed was the final step in a sequence that began with being detected. Remove detection, and death should have been impossible. The American weapon simply deleted that first step from the sequence. It killed men who had never been seen, and it left the survivors reaching for explanations, calling it automatic artillery, calling it a secret weapon, calling it whispering death, because their entire theory of how a man dies in battle had just been quietly proven not to apply. And here is the final irony, the one that ties the whole thing together. This weapon, which so completely defeated the logic of concealment, was itself born from a mission of concealment and chemistry. It was designed to lay smoke and to deliver gas, to hide armies and to poison them. It came from the least wanted branch in the army, a branch built for a war that fear and luck ensured was never fought. Denied its chemical purpose, the weapon was handed a bag of high explosive and white phosphorus and sent into a conventional war it had never been meant to fight, and there it turned out to be one of the most effective infantry killers of the entire conflict. The gas weapon that never fired gas became the shell that fell out of a silent sky onto men who had done everything right. The German grenadier in the hedgerow was not beaten because his camouflage failed, or his training failed, or his courage failed. None of those things failed. He was beaten because the weapon falling on him did not care whether he had been seen, and nothing in the war he had been trained to fight had prepared him for an enemy that no longer needed to find him in order to kill him. That is why German troops respected the four-deuce more than they expected to. Not because it was the biggest weapon on the field, because it was not. Not because it had the longest reach, because it did not. They respected it because it broke the one rule they had staked their lives on, the rule that said an unseen man is a safe man, and it broke that rule in silence, from a tube they never saw, served by men the rest of the army had once laughed at, firing a weapon designed for a war that never came. If this account gave you a new way of seeing a weapon most histories barely mention, consider subscribing, so the next deep dive into the forgotten machinery of this war reaches you when it lands. The story of how things actually worked, and how the men on the receiving end understood what was killing them, is almost always stranger and more human than the version that made it into the textbooks.